Hi everyone. Just really, I'm Beverly's warm-up act, to be fair, because she's doing so much for us. So really, just a big thank you to John for coming along tonight. He did an excellent tour for the group not too long ago, and Beverly took note of his number for future arrangements, and here we are tonight. So John, I believe you're more inclined to be doing the in-person talks. We really appreciate you grappling with technology, and in that regard, Beverly, you can get no better support than Beverly, who is our tech wizard and has been such a great help. There may not have been armchair talks, but if you see the analogy of the slide, Beverly has been gliding through, but furiously sorting out financial problems for multiple events for multiple people since the start of the year at this stage. So big thank you to her too. So I'll hand back to Beverly, but thanks both John and Beverly will now introduce John and introduce him to the group.
Yes, good evening, everybody. It's so nice to be here tonight, and it's so nice to have John as our speaker. As Christine mentioned, we've done a couple of excellent walking tours with John, and he is, as we all know, a local historian. His particular specialism is on urban history and the development of Dublin. He has a BA in history, an honours degree from UCD, and an MA in political communications. He's done a great deal of research on the history of the Dorset Street area, together with its famous residents, including such luminaries as tonight's subject, Arthur Griffith, and the writers Iris Murdoch and Sean O'Casey. John regularly gives walking tours under the auspices of the Five Lamps Festival, and recently, as mentioned, a number of us had a wonderful time on his Dorset Street walking tour. So John, please begin. Give me 2 seconds to get you showing. There we go. Whenever you like, John.
Beverly, thank you very much for that introduction, and Chris too. And I feel like very humbled by that introduction. But all I can say is it's going to take the format of an armchair talk this evening, and I'd like everyone just to bear that in mind. It make it more as a free and frank discussion more than anything else. I'm not going to rattle off dates and quiz questions to everybody for them to answer at the end of the armchair talk, but perhaps one I will pose to everybody at the moment, at this point in the talk, is the three characters in front of us. Karl Marx, we also have Arthur Griffith in the centre, and Chairman Mao on the right. And I'm just going to pose the question to everybody, and you can think about it throughout the armchair talk as to what do these three men have in common. And before anyone says facial hair, Mao Zedong does not. And before anyone says spectacles, Karl Marx and Mao Zedong do not. So just think about that question. And by the end of the talk, I'd like to hear what you think. So I'm going to go to my first part of the talk now. So essentially the talk this evening is about Arthur Griffith, but essentially what shaped him. And when I'm thinking about what shaped him, the city of Dublin is primarily what I'm thinking, but I also refer to 4 Ps as well as place that have shaped Griffith. So you think of poverty, people, the printing, and politics. And of those 4, they're all interlinked. I mean, the people he met, it's interesting that many would have come from his background, from both his area, but also some of the characters that he met. Similarly, a lot of the people he were dealt with came from the industry, either through where he worked in the printing industry, in the publishing industry, both also those who were seeking to get things published, but also how that then follows through into politics, how important the printing press was for the dissemination of ideas, such as these political ideas that he started to formulate throughout his adult life. The poverty, of course, really had a indelible and it's a unrelenting mark on his life. Even towards the end of his life, it was difficult for him to say he actually lived in one location. So much so towards the end of his life, people actually had a fundraiser to actually buy him his home, which is now in Clontarf if anyone's interested to have a look as to where he was last living. The people, as I said, come from all walks of life. But what's interesting about Arthur Griffith, despite his poverty, he did mix in very interesting circles. So whether there were people amongst his own family, his own neighborhood, but also those that were involved in the cultural revival, the cultural nationalism, and the nationalist revival movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. Printing as well, it wasn't just a case of what he was publishing in terms of newspapers, but he was also involved in giving people breaks, and perhaps the most famous of those I'll refer to later in this armchair talk. And of course, ultimately, politics. And those previous three definitely shaped his politics, his poverty, his upbringing. It raised questions in his mind as to why Ireland was the way it was, the people who influenced him, both in terms of education and also in terms of his wider circle of friends and those he would have collaborated throughout his political development. And of course, printing then as well, that fed through to politics. And we see that most notably in the publication of his famous work later in his life. So the next slide. So we talked about place at the beginning, and of course, Arthur Griffith was born in Dublin. Arthur Griffith was born in Upper Dominic Street, number 61 to be precise, in 1871. And in the 1870s, Dublin was a stagnating and declining city. And the map in front of you there is Dublin in 1800. What's remarkable is by 1870, the city had not really much changed. Within 5 to 10 minutes of what is now known as O'Connell Street, you would have seen farmland. You would have had a very undeveloped inner city, apart from the concentration around the quays and between the North Circular roads and the South Circular roads. You would have had very little actual development beyond that. You had the evolution of townships on the edge of the city, but the city itself did not develop to any great extent in the 19th century. Just to give you a sense of how things were changing in Dublin, by 1800, the city was growing and was becoming one of the greatest cities in Europe. So, for example, at the same time in 1800, Dublin was approximately 300,000 people, whereas Manchester, we're talking about 90,000 people, Belfast, 20,000 people. So Dublin was a wealthy, bustling, noisy, developing and growing city. However, in my next slide, you'll see broadly the same city still intact. That's Dublin around 1900. And you can see there, even in its very high level outline, the North Circular and the South Circular roads still define the city. There still is within that map farmland quite close to the city centre, and the only developments that were taking place from the outskirts or beyond the city of Dublin, they would not have fallen under the jurisdiction of Dublin Corporation. So that's the environment of Dublin in the 19th century. It had not grown. By 1800, it was a growing, developing metropolis that was a cultural centre in Europe, was really somewhere people were noticing, one of the great cities in Europe that was emerging, a real great, well-planned, well-thought-out city. By 1900, none of that was continuing. It had stagnated and in many respects was reversing, and it was not growing at the same rate, nor was it in any shape or form developing like its contemporaries in Europe. So the golden years of Dublin, the 18th century, probably best personified by Henrietta Street. Now, at the time of its construction, it was the grandest street in Dublin. It was a real preeminent street, preeminent Georgian street in Dublin. It was set the tone what Georgian Dublin was to become in the 18th century. And throughout the 18th century, Dublin had developed similar streets, whether it be Dorset Street, whether it be Gardner Street, whether it be Sackville Mall, or what we now know as O'Connell Street, Rutland Square, and on the south side, Marion Square, Marion Streets, and so on. These were all symbols of power and wealth in a growing, prosperous, and confident city. Yet by 1800, that was changing, as I mentioned earlier. And even worse still, by 1900, we had the emergence of slums and dereliction and housing collapsing into the city. Now, where that is relevant to Arthur Griffith is he was growing up in that environment of a declining and decaying city. He was growing up in an environment where there was slums, the wealth was leaving the city. It was very obvious Dublin was not going anywhere fast. Those who had money were leaving the city. There wasn't much in terms of employment opportunities. If there was, they were for very poorly paid and insecure jobs and so on. And for many Irish people, the only way to prosper was basically to leave. And that wasn't unique in Arthur Griffith's time either. Probably a very visible symbol and potent symbol of Dublin's decline in the 19th century is the streetscape on the left-hand corner there. And that's Mount Joy Street, just south of Berkeley Road. And to your immediate left on that picture, you'll see 4-storey over basement Georgian houses. Then to the right, you'll see 3-storey over basement houses. Then to the right again, 2-storey over basement houses. And towards the end of that picture, you actually end up with 1-storey houses. And that's a very visible representation of how Dublin was declining in the 19th century, from the 4-storey over basement in 1800 right down to 1-storey cottages in a European city centre by the close of the 19th century. On the right, the 20th century didn't improve that much. Dereliction and examples of people being killed in house collapses were starting to emerge in the city of Dublin. And for a recap as to why that was, I'm going to go to the next slide, just to give you a sense of the profound, stagnation and decline that was taking place in Dublin. So there wasn't a phrase called the deposed capital, and that's very true in my view. Sorry, I'm going to go back one. Sorry, bear with me. So in 1800, Dublin had 250 people approximately. It was one of the largest cities. It was either the largest in Ireland, and in Ireland and Britain, it was second only to London. To give you an example of the comparison, around the same time, Paris is 500,000, Manchester 90,000, Belfast 20,000. Dublin was a well-planned, directed, driven, developed city. It was a prosperous city, and it was a centre of trade and commerce, and it prospered very well. I mean, the public buildings it had were first class. They were the envy of other cities in Europe. But by 1900, didn't progress as they may have done so. In the rest of Europe, cities were growing, they were developing, they were growing taller. In the previous slide there, Dublin was stagnating, and if they were building smaller buildings because there was no demand for them. There was no great demand to live in Dublin. Dublin was, in many respects, just going nowhere fast. It was well outside the top 10 European cities in 1900, whereas previously it was in the top 10. Dublin was one of the smaller cities in the then United Kingdom. And again, to give you a sense of how things had changed, Belfast went from 20,000 to 350,000 in that space of time, whereas Dublin barely moved. And Belfast was then also the preeminent city in Ireland at that point. It was a stagnating, declining city. There was dreadful health statistics there, as you may be aware of. Those who were dying in childbirth, those who were dying of preventable diseases were quite high in Dublin in comparison to other European cities. There was a flight of wealth from the city. And while you did have prosperous pockets in Dublin, they were basically in other jurisdictions that were outside the control of Dublin corporations. So for example, you had Black Mines, or Kingstown as it was then called, or perhaps Clontarf on the north side, whereas the city centre was declining rapidly, and many these formerly grand townhouses were turned into slums. And Dublin, instead of being a wealthy capital in 1800, it became really a provincial, a regional centre in the then United Kingdom. And it was more doing administration than any sort of commercial and industrial powerhouse like the other cities that were growing in the United Kingdom at the time. For example, Manchester is one, Birmingham is another. So that gives you a sense of the background as to the environment Arthur Griffith was growing up in 1870. And why is this relevant to this conversation today? Well, Arthur Griffith's main work, The Resurrection of Hungary, is all about Ireland losing its power, and Ireland, and the reason why Ireland stagnated was due to the fact we lost our independence. We lost our independent parliament in College Green under the 1801 Act of Union. And with that, the material signs of decline, poverty, were not just surrounding him when he was growing up, but generally the Irish economy was declining, in his view, due to that single act, that Ireland losing control of its affairs would mean that Ireland would be impoverished, and the affairs of England would always take precedence over the affairs of Ireland. So the next slide is really just a mishmash of people that he would have been heavily associated with or would have engaged with in his life. Also some places that may be relevant to you. Again, this is an armchair talk. There's definitely a lot more people that would have influenced and shaped his life, but this is just a flavor of some of them I'd like to go through. So in terms of places, I put up there Trinity College and the National Library there on the bottom, on the top right-hand corner, a place called An Stad, which is still there on North Street, but unfortunately in a derelict state. On Trinity College, while he didn't attend university, it's interesting that it gives you a sense of the person himself. He actually read a lot of periodicals that were published, and most importantly, economic periodicals that were published by Trinity College. That gives you a sense of his appetite for learning, even though he didn't go to university. It's also mentioned as well that he would have spent many afternoons in the National Library of Ireland studying texts, again, given his wide in economics, in history and politics, not just in Ireland, but in other countries. He would have read a lot of texts, such as the National Library of Ireland, that would have informed and shaped his political thinking. And on Stad, which is on the top right there, hand corner, that is an example of the salon / I'd say cultural revival gatherings that he would have been involved in. That building was very much an important cultural hub in Dublin in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he would have had meetings in there, not just to listen to speakers, but actually to present his own views on political and cultural events at the time. And also, it's also mentioned that Sinn Féin itself, its alleged, was founded in An Stad at one of the meetings that he would have held there in the early 20th century. In terms of the people in this picture, you've got Mulgán in the centre, and she looked favorably on. She thought he was an interesting man, and she was very much part of the cultural revival movement in Ireland in the late 19th, early 20th century. So again, this gives you a flavour of the type of figures that he was involved in. So if you're turning clockwise to the right of Mulgán, a gentleman called Walter Cole. And Walter Cole, in many respects, is a key unsung, I would say, hero, also perhaps an unknown person to a certain extent, would have shaped and also influenced Arthur Griffith quite a lot, but not just in terms of politics, but also financially. As I mentioned earlier, poverty shaped Arthur Griffith, and Walter would have subbed him. He would have given him money, would have looked after him despite all the poverty, the fact that he was down on his luck. People like Walter Cole helped Arthur Griffith throughout his life. He wasn't the only one, but he was one of the closest friends and one of those who would help him out quite a lot. Below Walter Cole's wife, Maud, and unfortunately for her, perhaps a very long engagement with her. So An Stad would have been key, as I mentioned, for his political, cultural meetings that he would have been part of in the early 20th century. And I also mentioned Walter Cole there, but also underneath Walter Cole there is Maud, his future wife. And unfortunately for her, she had to I would say, suffer a prolonged engagement. But again, that's due to the fact that Arthur Griffith did suffer again from being in a very poor state financially. And in those days, and to an extent it still exists, people generally, or men generally, like the idea that they'd want to have sufficient funds to marry the woman of their dreams. And in the early 20th century, it was no different. And in this case, he thought he couldn't provide for us. That explains the particularly long engagement she had to endure. So apart from that, below that, you see Eamon de Valera. I don't know whether I'd say much about his relationship with Eamon de Valera. I'd say it was tetchy. Definitely the treaty talks, would have strained that relationship. But I think there was a mutual admiration to some extent between both. James Joyce, to the left of Eamon de Valera, he's quite interesting in that he's an example of the people that Arthur Griffith fostered in his publications. So not forgetting that Arthur Griffith's from a printing background, he published newspapers also, and the first recorded works of James Joyce, the first of those was published in one of his newspapers in the early 20th century. And in this case, I think James Joyce took that as a sort of a very generous thing for Arthur Griffith to do. And he, in turn, I'd say, repaid the compliment in Ulysses, where he does refer to Arthur Griffith a few times in that work. Also to the left, you can see W.B. Yeats, apparently very close friend of Arthur Griffith, but for some reason, and I haven't got to the bottom of it, W.B. Yeats took a dislike towards Arthur Griffith later in his political career. And I find that curious insofar as, in many respects, Arthur Griffith promoted W.B. Yeats, and also he extolled the virtues of poetry, saying it was some of the greatest poetry ever written. And yet, for some reason, W.B. Yeats became or grew up to dislike Arthur Griffith. James Connolly, also below W.B. Yeats there, he was also considered a friend of Arthur Griffith. There's a quote saying that Arthur Griffith refers to James Connolly as my friend James Connolly in correspondence. And of course, while he didn't agree with his socialist outlook, he certainly had a lot in common with James Connolly in terms of asserting Irish independence. And then finally, just above James Connolly, we have Michael Collins there. Again, close collaborator of Griffith in the treaty negotiations. But Michael Collins looked up to Arthur Griffith, and he would have held him in very high esteem. He would have been aware of all of Arthur Griffith's work, intellectual work, should I say, as a basis for for supporting Irish independence. So I mentioned before about Trinity College and the appetite that Arthur Griffith had for self-learning or self-knowledge. And to give you a sense again of the limited formal education he was educated in St. Mary's Place there, and that school still stands, St. Joseph's there, Christian Brothers School on St. Mary's Place. That is an example of, I would say, self-learning, but also kind of sense of the character that Arthur Griffith was. He was curious, very much interested in culture, very wide-ranging interests, from economics to philosophy to politics. And he also read widely beyond that which he learned in school, in primary school. He didn't go to secondary school, but he is recorded as attending libraries throughout the city. It does help Griffith that he was brought up in a printer's environment and that he was a printer himself. No doubt that helped in terms of his education. In late 19th century Dublin, being a printer was considered a reasonably respectable position in your local neighborhood, insofar as people would consult with printers if they had difficulties with the authorities or difficulties in terms of formal correspondence, because they were seen as educated. Naturally enough, they would know English, and therefore those who were less literate would come to them for advice and so on. So that knowledge and background in printing had an impact on Griffith insofar as it enabled him, if he wanted to start publishing newspapers, start publishing his ideas, which started to evolve in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, for example, the publication of the United Irishman as a national weekly was taking place in 1899. Then also that went to the wall. The circulation's reasonably small, but it didn't stop him. He was determined, even if he was broke, to keep at it. And with some subscriptions and some funding from friends, again, we mentioned some of his friends were key to his enterprises and also his maintenance and his living. He also got funding for a new publication called Sinn Féin. But leaving those publications aside and how they contributed to, I'd say, the radical element of nationalism in the 19th century, it is his formal publication in the early 20th century, The Resurrection of Hungary, in 1905, is without doubt key not to just his ideas, but also key to understanding what he wanted from any change in Irish policy, whether that be home rule or something different. And his choice of words as well, resurrection, that's also interesting. That suggests and effectively means we're not talking about something that's new, we're talking about bringing back something to life. And the book itself, it refers to the resurrection of Hungary, as in the resurrection of a country which existed before, which was being forcibly assimilated, in his view, into Austria, resisting, but also resurrecting itself and creating its own country again. And what's interesting is this was a departure from the established, I'd say, established wisdom at that time in Ireland. In 1905, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Home Rule Party, were still in the ascendant. They were seen as inevitably going to get the prize of home rule at some point in the future. And in many respects, they were part of the establishment, whereas Arthur Griffith was doing something radically different. He disliked the Home Rule Party, especially after Parnell was gone. He started to, I say, evolve his ideas on home rule. And the resurrection of Hungary gives you a proper flavor of what that evolution would look like. Instead of seeking home rule from the British, the resurrection of Hungary says we don't need to seek it. We are entitled to it. We are entitled to it by virtue that we had our own parliament before. We have our own constitution in the 18th century. The Act of Union was an aberration. It shouldn't have happened. And we simply need to reassert our independence that we have already. And we do not need the assent of the British Parliament to that independence. And it is an interesting take and an interesting departure from the home rule establishment, the home rule mentality that was dominating Irish politics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So in terms of his politics, you couldn't really assess whether he was left or right. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, he was a friend of James Connolly, but I wouldn't describe him as a socialist. And he had a suspicion of internationalism, and he thought that socialism was basically internationalism. He thought Ireland itself should know what is best for itself. And again, names such as Sinn Féin and so on, Ourselves Alone, they give you a flavour again of the political outlook that we should decide, we know what's best for ourselves. He was suspicious of international movements. The resurrection of Hungary, as I mentioned already, outlined his political thinking and a platform for his ideas. Essentially, Ireland's rights were not subject to London. Ireland had an inalienable right to govern itself. It had it in the 18th century. It was a prosperous country in the 18th century. The 19th century, that all disappeared because London ruled for London's interests, not for Ireland's interests. And only could we become a rich, prosperous nation again when we ruled from our own interests, and that in our own parliament. Now, curiously enough as well, that despite that book being a bestseller and arguably the fastest selling book in Irish history, Apparently 5,000 copies were sold in the first 24 hours of its publication. He relatively was in obscurity and also a sort of a hidden figure in Irish politics before 1916. And just to give an example of that, John Redmond, the leader of the Home Rule Party, rarely mentions Arthur Griffith in his correspondence before 1916. He's only mentioned, I think, once in the recorded correspondence of John Redmond, the leader of the Home Rule Party. So he was a very much a marginal figure, and he was not one that people would assume would become a natural leader of Ireland. And again, by 1916, Home Rule was seen as inevitable. And again, the establishment parties, the Home Rule Party was seen as the inevitable party that would achieve independence. And all these rabble-rousers or radicals, just leave them alone. There's nothing to listen to here, nothing to see here, nothing going on here. That all changed in 1916. For better or for ill, and as an accident of history, or not, as the case may be, the 1916 Rising was constantly referred to in the British press as the Sinn Féin Rising. With that, people associated with Sinn Féin, such as Arthur Griffith, became the targets of opprobrium, of arrests, of again, even including up to being sentenced to death for being associated with the 1916 Rising. It again became very clouded and not very clear as to what was going on in 1916. And Sinn Féin, because of that publicity, was considered part of that rising. Sinn Féin did not start the 1916 Rising, but they were heavily associated with it, of course. But the British press, they essentially said it was a Sinn Féin Rising, the Sinn Féin rebellion in Dublin. And with that, as a central figure of Sinn Féin, no doubt, Arthur Griffith became a target for both being considered the ringleader or one of the ringleaders of this so-called Sinn Féin plot. And also he started to get a notoriety that perhaps he didn't even expect after 1916. And then following the War of Independence and also the later series of elections after 1918, Arthur Griffith became invariably at the leadership or deputy leadership, and I would say almost a reluctant leader in some respects of the provisional government. It is said of Arthur Griffith that he never wanted to lead a revolution or lead the change, but he wanted to establish the strategy that Ireland should aspire to and also help deliver that as opposed to lead it. He did lead in negotiations of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, of course, in 1921 when he was chair of the Irish delegation. And in many respects, some people say he did his best, some people argue otherwise. I mean, I'm not here to argue either way, but there's no doubt that he did work extensively, and some would say to his exhaustion in 1921. Then there's questions about his outlook as well, and there's mixed messages as well about Arthur Griffith later on, whether he was fully non-sectarian or not. There's certain references to him being anti-clerical, that he believed that the religious divide in Ireland was fostered by the division from the 19th century Act of Union, and that it wasn't, he would not be coloured by religious divisions. Then there's others who say otherwise. In many respects, on balance, I think he didn't expect to lead the Irish Revolution intellectually, but by accident or design, he actually is the intellectual catalyst for all the events that took place from 1916, both in terms of his ideas, the wording used, both in terms of formulating printing presses for radical ideas and publications for radical ideas, and ideas that were different from the established norms in the early 20th century. Again, Home Rule was seen as an inevitable result of the Home Rule Party, but he did not agree with Home Rule. He saw Home Rule as, again, Ireland depending on London to give its assent to Ireland having its independence. And wording is really important here as well. Talking about resurrection, the 1916 Rising is also refers to, again, a resurrection of sorts. But when it came to the settlement in 1921 with the British government, the word used was a treaty. London would have looked at that as an agreement between a political party and the London government in giving a form of home rule to Ireland, whereas Arthur Griffith and the others were insistent it was a treaty between two established states. And that's an important distinction. That also follows through from his ideas in his work, The Resurrection of Hungary, which refers to the fact that his view is Ireland has an inalienable right to its independence. It had it in the 18th century, and it did not extinguish. Rather, it was legally removed by the Act of Union. So his legacy, well, he didn't seek preferment. I think if Arthur Griffith was around today, he'd probably be, I'd say he'd be okay with the fact that he wasn't remembered that much. And why would I say that? Well, he didn't seem to want to be a leader. He wanted to have Ireland regain its independence, and he wanted Ireland to be a prosperous country. He wanted his people, he wanted people around him, he wanted his neighbours and so on to benefit from independence. Definitely wasn't associated with seeking riches and notoriety. I mean, the reality is he was poor for most of his life. The only time he had a settled home was just before his death, where some friends of his did some, I'd say, money raising to buy him a house in Clontarf. So the actual first president of the provisional government following the treaty would have a home to go to when he needed it, because it was quite startling that he didn't really have a fixed abode for most of his life. And his recent 100th anniversary of his death, it almost passed without commemoration. That says a lot too. I mean, I think there's a lot of embarrassment in political circles when it comes to Arthur Griffith, because no one can really claim him, but yet nearly every major political party can claim him. So it's ambiguous. And then you've also got his legacy. Is it remembered even or commemorated in our places? And yes, of course, we've got Griffith Avenue, Griffith Park, Griffith's Barracks, and also the cenotaph itself. And it's the picture that's in the screen there in front of you is actually part of Griffith Avenue, quite a fine place to be named after. If you do have a legacy, it's probably one of the nicest streetscapes in Dublin. So in that respect, he has something that has been, I would say, it's a nice thing to have named after you. Then the cenotaph as well, that commemorates others. Again, most people don't even know about that monument that's in the back of Leinster House. So when they see it, they don't even know what it's for. But part of that monument, the obelisk behind Leinster House, is actually to commemorate Arthur Griffith's life. And finally, his actual burial place in Glasnevin, it's quite symbolic. It's if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend you do have a look at it. It's a broken column, and that refers to a sort of a legend in ancient Greece and their funeral monuments, where a broken column has great significance and is supposed to symbolize an unfinished or a life cut short. And in many respects, Arthur Griffith's death in 1922 was a life cut short. He was relatively young. He was in his early 50s, and I think he could have brought a lot more stability to the state than did transpire immediately after his death. The Civil War was still about to have its most violent phases, and I would have hoped that if he survived, it might have perhaps prevented or at least alleviated the suffering and pain that took place during the Civil War. Of course, what followed very closely afterwards was Collins's death. Again, another body blow to possible avoidance of a civil war in Ireland. And just finally, I look at the recommended reading. So Colm Kenny's book, The Enigma of Arthur Griffith, won definitely to read if you want more information on his life. One I've read recently in particular is Owen McGee's Arthur Griffith. And of course, The Resurrection of Hungary itself, the actual publication by Griffith, that's still in print and is available online if you do want to get a copy of it. And there's also an online resource. There's a lecture series on RTE from the 1970s, and there's a documentary called Rock Among Men, and it's about Arthur Griffith. It refers to his full life, and there's a lot of detail in that as well, and it's worth listening to too. So at the beginning, I had that unusual threesome, for want of a better word. So if I may, the actual thing that they have in common is they all published books, and they all published books that changed their world or changed the world. And certainly the Irish Revolutionary period, I contend, would probably not have happened, should I say, if Arthur Griffith's Resurrection of Hungary was not published. On that note, I'll stop and shut up.
Well, we definitely don't want you to shut up, but we will set ourselves up now for the Q&A. So give me a second now to get that organized. Great stuff. I will unmute people, or allow people to unmute. And thank you begin by thanking you very, very much indeed. So would anybody like to start off the questions?
Hi, John. I'll jump in first. Two things. I lived for years on Griffith Avenue, never associated with Arthur Griffith. I thought it was after some posh English lord or something. You ruined my childhood. and secondly, I must agree with you that there's grave side, the gravestone in Glasnevin is absolutely beautiful. A life cut short, and it's gorgeous. It's so symbolic. Yeah, I didn't realize it was from Greek origin, but it's a lovely, lovely statue. Yeah, very good talk. Really interesting. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for that, Geraldine. Well, it may not have been a British lord, but actually you do raise an interesting point. Griffith himself, the name is of Welsh origin, and he does trace his roots back to Wales several generations back. But what's interesting about his surname as well is that apparently the Welsh meaning of Griffith means stubborn.
Oh.
If there was, I would say, a description, an apt description of Arthur Griffith, it would be stubborn. Despite everything, despite his poverty, despite all those things going against him, even his physical appearance, he wasn't the most, dominating figure, even physically. He was a small man. He still was stubbornly, adhering to his ideas. He got them published, despite his poverty, despite the financial difficulties. He persisted. His newspapers were closed down, whether by financial reasons or was it because he actually was shut down by the British government. He still went ahead and raised more money to publish them again, or organized printing press to get them published again. So in many respects, his name is really important, I think. If, for example, you believe in nominative determinism, as the phrase goes, Griffith, I think, could be said to be stubborn. He was stubbornly persistent. And did you mention something else as well, Geraldine?
His gravestone in Glasnevin is beautiful.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that as well is up until relatively recently, that was a hidden gravestone. It wasn't prominent. Thankfully, my last visit just earlier this year, they did a very good job in cleaning up the immediate space around it. And previously it was quite cluttered and you wouldn't notice unless you went looking for it, but now it's quite prominent. And I think for someone who has been relatively airbrushed out of Irish history, it actually seemed to be, I think, a nice tribute to him to actually say, actually, we do acknowledge the fact you had an impact and we've given you a greater prominence now.
Yeah, that's great. A great talk. Thanks a lot.
Someone else? Yeah. Yeah. John, forgive me if I'm stating the obvious here, but why do you think he was airbrushed out of history that way? Was he on the wrong side of some issue, or why do you think that was? Yeah.
It's an odd one, Beverly. I think, you know, like it's like probably being back at school where if you're on your own and you're prominent, you're fine. But if you've got others crowding around you, you're in trouble. And I think his difficulty was he was surrounded by big personalities, both the 1916 Rising, which basically made, you know, the leaders of that rising almost like semi-godlike in Irish history. But then on the flip side, those that weren't involved in 1916 Rising, but after the event and were part of the political settlement, Collins, De Valera, you know, competing with the sexy, interesting guerrilla war man versus, you know, the longevity of De Valera, who was there for most of the 20th century, and Griffith, only a few years in between. I don't think he could compete. I think that's what he suffered from. I think that's part of the explanation. I think what also is difficult for Griffith is, even though he did find the original Sinn Féin, his version of Sinn Féin would be different to what Sinn Féin is today. Now, again, it's of its time, but the Sinn Féin of his conception would have been one that would have been okay with the concept of dual monarchy, the idea of Ireland deciding for itself that it wanted a monarchy or not. Whereas different iterations since don't really like that idea. Then you also got the Civil War split. Some people claiming Griffith, some people not. Fianna Fáil might not necessarily have claimed Griffith, but ultimately they all owe their origins to Griffith. But I think because it's not clear cut, nobody owns him, and perhaps nobody wants him.
Oh, dear. Less charismatic, obviously, than the people that you had mentioned.
It's also interesting, he didn't seem to want to be a leader, and perhaps, fair enough, he is an accidental leader, perhaps. Certainly 1916, if that never happened, I doubt he would have come to prominence as we know him today.
Had he any children, John? You were saying he had a very old, late marriage. Had he children? No.
He had 2 children, yeah, and descendants still are alive today. I think grandchildren are still alive.
Oh, great.
And John, whereabouts in Clontarf? What is his address in Clontarf?
I don't have the number in front of me, but it's St. Lawrence Road, and there is
St. Lawrence, yeah.
There is a plaque outside.
Right.
It's quite a nice house, but it's worth bearing in mind that he never really had a fixed abode as such. He had his origins in Upper Dominic Street, but he's living in pockets around Summerhill in the inner city itself. He also lived in Glasnevin, but it was a bit of a embarrassment by the time the treaty negotiations were being finalised and a provisional government was being created, that he actually didn't have a fixed abode. So there was a concerted effort to buy him a house.
Right, yeah. Oh, yeah, nice place. Like Griffith Avenue is lovely as well, as you said.
But do I understand that he had no direct association with Griffith Avenue?
No, not just.
Well,
it was just named after him.
Unless his ghost was around at the time, no. Griffith Avenue was a concept that originated, the actual road itself originated in the early 1920s, but the naming itself was well after his death, and it wouldn't have even been referred to as Griffith Avenue then.
And it could be linked with Marino, you know, the social housing that was there, and that would have been, I suppose, the 1930s, would it?
Yeah, so I'm putting on my urban history hat now. So that part of Dublin, generally, the concept was just before Ireland got its independence, but the actual building of it was in the early and late 1920s. And the outline of Griffith Avenue was established by the late 1920s. So
yeah.
there was a great plan drawn up in the early 20th century to redesign Dublin, and the outline of what they would call nowadays a ring road around Dublin. There was an idea of having what we now know as Griffith Avenue was evolving from that time.
Right, yeah. Okay, thanks. And thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. Yeah, because as you say, people don't know much about Griffith. So good to hear it.
It seems a bit astonishing in that he was a printer. You would think he would be able to have taken charge of his own posterity in those circumstances.
I suppose it's a bit like if you were like an IT specialist today, you frighten most people and they think you're a whiz kid and you can influence so many things, influencers and so on. But in many ways, he was his ready-made influencer. He had the ability to have access to printing press. He was a printer by trade. The problem is today you can be, as they call it, social influencer, and you don't need much money. In those days, printing did cost money, and unless your sales were good, it was tough going. And the sales of publications were never that great, with the exception of his book.
Okay.
I think Sinn Féin is particularly critical of him. So if they have more influence than they do at the moment, he'll probably be airbrushed further. And the other thing I notice is that there's trees gone on Griffith Avenue where there's a new development. So I hope that doesn't continue, because I lived near there as well. They said that it wasn't because the apartments, it was because they were becoming dangerous. So if some of them are becoming dangerous, the rest of them could too.
Well, if nobody wants to claim Arthur Griffith, I think the main thing is the word Sinn Féin is down to him. And I think that if I was to say, does it matter? That'd probably be my response as well. Does it really matter that the current political situation, do they want him or not? It's not, in my view, that relevant. It's where the origins were, and he is the founder of the Sinn Féin party, the original Sinn Féin party, the name. So yes, politics has evolved. Like Irish history is interesting in that you've had so many versions of Sinn Féin since the 1916 rising. Maybe in the future there'll be more, but ultimately the name comes back to Arthur Griffith. And as for the trees in Griffith Avenue, I love Griffith Avenue myself, so I would hope that any trees that are being felled would be replaced. But I think that's more to do with construction work rather than a program of chopping. I'd hope so anyway.
Well, the reply I saw was it was because they weren't safe anymore. Nice. But of course, I don't know whether that's true or not.
We've gotten some nice messages in the chat. Mary says, very interesting talk. Thanks, John. Arthur Griffith is such a prominent figure, but not one we know much about at all, which is interesting. Must be a story there, as we've been teasing out just now as well. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's, sorry, I didn't mean to cut in on you, Bev.
No, go ahead.
No, I just think it's a pity. There's been such probably a lionizing of Michael Collins, really, and somewhat of a demonization of Dev. And I think if the third character, if you could call him that, was brought in as well, people might learn that some people get some of it right and some people get more of it right, but it needs different views to get the right solution. I think it's been very black and white.
I think you're touching on a really important point, Reid, in that there's always a danger of thinking our heroes are whiter than white, and inevitably they're flawed. And Michael Collins, I'm sure, if he lived to a ripe old age, his flaws would become more apparent. That's human nature. But I think he died in tragic circumstances, which by default makes him more heroic figure, a romantic figure. Whereas De Valera lived till old age, and by that stage, people are saying, "Oh, I had enough of him. Move on, please," And
he might have outstayed his welcome to
yeah, I think De Valera, I won't go into political matters, but De Valera had his virtues as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think he clearly was a clever man, and I think some of his actions, in hindsight, perhaps were for the better of this country. Others, perhaps not. But again,
Totally, yeah.
checkered history. He wasn't without flaws. I think in the case of Griffith, between those two poles, like the caricature of Collins as the good guy and De Valera as the bad guy, Griffith maybe he wasn't one or the other,
Yeah.
And that's why maybe
I wonder how much do you think Neil Jordan is responsible for some of that perception in the movie Michael Collins?
Yeah, popular culture does have its impacts too, and yeah, I don't know if there's a way of counterbalancing that, but like history always evolves, as in people reassess the past regularly. I think De Valera's story might be rewritten again in a different light. You just don't know how things pan out. Maybe 50 years ago, it would have been lionized. Today, probably less so. Perhaps in 50 years' time, maybe lionized again. Who knows?
I think you're focusing in now on him sympathizing on the death of Hitler. And we're all supposed to feel guilty because he did that, and we now can't speak up, according to the Russian ambassador. We've no rights. We're simply, I wasn't around then, Even me, I wasn't around. Never mind most of what's alive now. So
in the age of social
we're
media,
still being blamed for that one act, particularly.
Well, I think the complex element there is in the age of social media. A quick statement like that is very damaging. Can be, for example, simplistic.
Yeah.
When in fact, the whole scenario, I'd say, outlook of De Valera, why he was behaving in such a way and so on, there's never time to look at that. Now, if that was examined in more detail and the time was given, people perhaps, regardless of what he did, whether it was that episode or other episodes, perhaps they would understand why. Now, that particular episode was based, I understand, on the idea of strict neutrality. Now, of course, people would just balk at the idea today, but perhaps in his head, that was strict neutrality. No side in the war he would take, and it's of its time. It's of his view of that time.
I think President Xi would agree with him. Strict neutrality regarding Ukraine is you talk to the Russians and you talk to the EU, so he's operating a similar thing at the moment.
Yeah, and again, I'm as a local historian, I'd be reluctant to get into today's issues, but I think you do.
I think we're straying a bit from the.
I mean,
as interesting as it all is.
This is very good for helping people shape views today as well, but I think in the case of Arthur Griffith, he tried his best, I think, to stay to his principles, which were outlined in his book. And those principles were, there was a historical precedent for Ireland's independence. It wasn't reliant on Britain giving it to us, and it all followed from there. And I think having that sort of long view of history can help people when it comes to contemporary matters, because not forgetting, when he was talking about that in 1905, active union was over 100 years old at that stage. So history was helpful in informing, but it was readapted to his particular outlooks at that time.
And what do they say? Hindsight is always 20/20. Yeah. Well, we had an interesting question in the chat. Was he a musician? Was Arthur Griffith a musician?
I think he might have sang. I might be wrong on that. I think he might have. He definitely was involved in so many cultural elements, cultural revival, both through the printing press and ideas about the Irish language and so on. I have a suspicion he sang. I might be wrong though.
Anybody else have any? It doesn't have to be a question. If you have some comment or insight you would like to share, I think John, the comprehensive nature of your talk, basically,
It's
so
very
the
good.
questions were largely answered.
Mhm.
With but it's very interesting and lots of food for thought.
Like I might just add, Beverly. I mean, I think it has been touched on earlier about even De Valero's mentioned. You know, Griffith is a complex figure in some respects. I think if I was, again, if anyone on this call is interested, I'd recommend they do read the biographies of him and also read the work that he has published, because that gives you a more rounded, I'd say, view of Arthur Griffith, but also it gives you great insight directly into what his thinking was. And I have a copy here. This is a copy of The Resurrection of Hungary, and that dates from, this is a publication from 1918. It's a second edition, and it refers to his ideas following the 1916 Rising, and refers to his ideas following the slaughter that was taking place in the First World War and the dreadful scenes in Europe. So it gives you a sense of his ideas through his own words. But also, I think the biography of him by also Kenny or McGee, they're very good rounded insights into the man as a whole. And if people are interested, I recommend that approach.
Thank you. Ooh, what's that? What's that chime?
Like just to give you a flavor, a bit more of the work, this actual work itself, it outlines his views on what a government of Ireland should look at, why we need an independent government in Ireland. For example, he thought that the manufacturing industry in this country was in decline because of the Active Union, that Irish affairs should be modelled for its own purposes. So, for example, we should have our own judiciary, we should have our own civil service, we should have our own consuls abroad. He wanted to make sure that we were fully engaged in the world, but at the same time, self-sufficient, independent, and not seeking independence from Britain, but rather asserting it because of our precedent that we were originally an independent country, and no one had the right to take that away from us. And I think it's interesting as well, that was a deviation from the established wisdom at that time, which was home rule means we go to London, we beg them for independence, they vote in the House of Commons that we give Ireland home rule, thank you very much. No, that wasn't his idea. His idea was we have that right regardless. We don't need to ask permission.
It's inherent. It's built in. Yeah. Which makes sense. Yeah.
I think what perhaps the only thing I regret on these armchair talks is that I'd love to show you around the areas where he grew up, and you might have got a flavour of that from the armchair talk. But if you do go into Dublin city centre, be mindful that a good place to start would be around Henrietta Street. That gives you a sense of the great city that Dublin once was in the 18th century. And then just shortly around the corner is his birthplace on Upper Dominic Street. And you can still see some elements of the housing that would have been around the time of his birth. And the condition at that stage, some of them would have been in very poor condition. They would have been living in flats as opposed to living in these grand Georgian houses that were built at that time in the 18th century.
Oh, gosh, thank you so much, John. And I strongly recommend, and I think everybody who's here today will agree with me, that we would like to go out on one of your walking tours and see around the Dorset Street area and the vicinity that you're so expert in. When we did the Dorset Street walk with John, we had an extraordinary experience where we were on Henrietta Street, and the owner of this incredibly beautiful and meticulously restored house invited us in to have a look at it. So that was quite a treat. And we were able to see the grandeur that was Henrietta Street in its day. Yeah.
And that's key, Beverly, in my view. And again, it's only my view. is that it must have had an impact on Arthur Griffith growing up, that he was living in poor conditions in a house that would have formerly been a grand house, would have been surrounded by equally grand houses, palaces, a fine city that was clearly crumbling and declining and filled with poor people, as opposed to a golden city that was being constructed in the 18th century. Dublin clearly had changed, and the neighbourhood he was in was clearly an example of a declining city, and that must have had an impact on him. And it's no doubt, in my mind, that he could not have come to the conclusion that in Irish independence was a solution for that, and that the area you grew up in, that area, the element of decline caused by that Act of Union in 1801 was the ultimate root cause, and that needs to be undone.
Did you think that to any extent his poverty, his financial poverty, obviously he had so many ideas, he was rich in ideas, but his financial poverty was part of why he's remained obscure?
What's interesting, I think, about Griffith, his poverty didn't seem to frighten him from asserting himself. I mean, he's, engaging with, I'd say, people who could say high above his station, for want of a better phrase. I mean, Maud Gonne wasn't exactly from rags. Other people he would have been engaging with at the time in the literary set, the Celtic revival set, they would have come from relatively good backgrounds, like even engaging with Douglas Hyde or people like that. I mean, these people were not penny poor themselves. I think he's unique in that respect, because he was called a shy individual, but it seemed to not inhibit him from contacting those who could have been seen at that time as his betters. I don't think that poverty was enough of a barrier to stop him being curious and engaging with people that ultimately shaped his ideas or influenced his ideas. And certainly it didn't stop him getting in touch with people who ultimately were financial benefactors. It would have been quite wealthy. For example, Walter Cole, the individual I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, he would have been a wealthy merchant in a very substantial property in central Dublin. He was best friends with Arthur Griffith, but Arthur Griffith hadn't a penny.
Right.
And of course, relatively speaking, of course, Arthur Griffith did have enough sustenance, but the fact is, engagement was made and prolonged, and the fact that he never had a fixed abode for most of his life, I mean, that spoke volumes.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. Yeah. Anybody else want to contribute? Well, I think then it's time for us to express our enormous thanks and gratitude to John for giving us this talk. Thank you very much indeed, and do please take us, suggest a walking tour and take us somewhere when you have some idea about that.
And just given the fact that some have mentioned Griffith Avenue there, I think if those who are interested in urban history, there's definitely, I think, a talk that I could give in the future about the evolution of Griffith Avenue and Marino, because I think it's perhaps the most interesting part of Dublin. It's an example of, I think, planning that goes right, planning that is, I think, it creates something beautiful as opposed to just building houses. Griffith Avenue, in my view, is one of the great achievements of 20th century Dublin, and it's one that we should be proud of.
Absolutely, I'd love to hear that. And it's the north side. Very important.
There were quite a number of thank yous and kind comments in the chat. What I will do, John, afterwards, I will send you, I always send the text file of the chat to the speakers so that you could see what people have said.
Very kind. And look, thank you all very much for your engagement. It's been a pleasure.
Great.